So first off, we want to welcome everyone to this year's conference of the United States Society for Ecological Economics. And we are happy that you found time to join us. We'll be enjoying a lot of programs lined up for us, several talks, and also interesting research from our members. So first, my name is Rolando Furi, and I'll be moderating the plenary session this morning. And so to keep everything well organized, we would ask that you keep your microphones off. And at the end of the plenary talk, we would all have the opportunity to ask the speaker questions. And of course, during the question and answer session, you can either use your mic or you can ask a question by sending a message on Zoom. So at this point, I will call on Dr. Laura Schmidt-Olabisi to introduce our plenary speaker.
Wonderful. Thank you, Roland. And thanks to everyone for joining us this morning, afternoon, or evening, whatever time of day it is for you in your local time. My name is Laura Schmidt-Olabisi. I am the current president of the U.S. Society for Ecological Economics. You'll hear a bit more from me later. But for now, it is my great pleasure and great honor to introduce a very special guest speaker we have with us for the plenary this morning, Dr. Vandana Shiva. This is someone whose work I have followed for some time. I'm sure many of you have as well. She is a scholar, an activist, an ecofeminist, the author of more than 20 books. She has received the Right Livelihood Award, among many other prestigious international awards. And she's also the founder of the Research Foundation for Science, Technology, and Natural Resource Policy. And it's her work, I think, fits in very well with the work of ecological economics in terms of thinking about how to live well and rightly on this earth that we all share. So it is my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Vandana Shiva. And as Roland said, please keep your mics muted, and you can put questions for Dr. Shiva in the chat, or you can wait until the end. And without further ado, Dr. Shiva, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Laura and Roland. And it's a pleasure to join the United States Society for Ecological Economics. This has been my journey for 5 decades and was not my planned journey. I planned to work in physics and the foundations of quantum theory, but the destruction of the Himalayan forests got me involved with ecology, with a movement called CHIPCO. And I have learned everything about the interface between ecology and economics from engagement with what is happening in reality. We all know that the terms ecology and economy come from the same root, oikos, our home, and yet they've been divorced to the extent that market-oriented development based on pure monetary transactions is constantly pitted against ecology. And this conflict has really reached its ultimate pinnacle right now with the financialization of nature. Over my life's work, I've realized there are actually 3 economies. An economy doesn't mean making money. Aristotle had a very clear word for that. He called it chrematistics, the art of money making. What we call economy today is merely the art of money making, but the true economy is the art of living. And since the earth is alive, the art of living has to be co-creation with the earth. As Barry Commoner wrote long ago, human beings have broken out of the cycle of life, driven not by biological needs, but by the social organizations which have devised to conquer nature. means of gaining wealth which conflict with those which govern nature. For me, nature's economy is the rules of nature governing herself and social rules of community working with nature in ways that the earth is not depleted, degenerated, destroyed. We know we are living through multiple emergencies that have become life-threatening. Just look at the news right now, the severe flooding of Bangladesh and Eastern India right now, 9 million people displaced. 9 million people. Hundreds are dying. Or look at the fires, look at the heat, look at the extreme events, but even the disappearance of species and the potential disappearance of our species, which is a very recent arrival on this planet. The earth is self-organized, and part of the error that Georgescu-Roegen called this economic slumber was basically assuming that all that matters is the flow of money, as he wrote in his seminal book, and I'm sure each of you have read it. I don't think that'd be Ecological Economics with Georgescu-Roegen. The no deposit, no return analogy benefits the businessman's view of economic life. For if one looks only at money, all one can see is that money just passes from one hand to another, except by regrettable accident, it never gets out of the economic process. Perhaps the absence of any difficulty in securing raw materials by those countries whose modern economics grew and flourished was yet another reason for economists to remain blind to this crucial economic factor. Not even the wars the same nations fought for the control of the world's natural resources awoke the economists from their slumber. I think it was in the 80s that a number of us got together and wrote a development dictionary guided by Ivan Illich, an amazing thinker of our times, edited by Wolfgang Sachs. And I was asked to write the essay on resources. Resources means that which renews. That is nature's economy. Nature's rivers renew. Nature's forests renew. Nature's soil renew. The redefinition of resources as raw material for industrial use came with the Industrial Revolution. It's quite recent. So in a way, it declared nature as dead. I call it the transformation of Terra Madre, the living earth, as self-organized, self-regulating living system, to a terra nullius with huge consequences, not just for the earth, but all the communities of the earth. I have worked very, very closely with amazing scientists like Mei-Wan Ho, who wrote a book on the physics of biology. And she talked to me a lot about the quantum theory. People like her taught me my biology. My sisters in Chipko taught me my ecology in practice. As Mei-Wan writes in her book, in one of her interviews, life in the ideal is a domain that captures and stores energy and mobilizes it quantum coherently in perfectly coupled cycles that generate no entropy. This is something that Schrödinger also said, that living systems create negative entropy, mechanical industrial systems create entropy, part of which is the climate havoc or the pollution. In a quantum coherent universe, and the universe is quantum coherence, all beings are both localized as particles and solid objects and delocalized as quantum wave functions, spread ultimately throughout the universe. This was the subject of my doctoral thesis, non-locality in quantum theory. And the research at that time was much more in terms of imaginary experiments. But now it has gone much more advanced that you can never separate this interconnected universe. It stays interconnected and it stays organized. Hence, all beings are mutually entangled and mutually constitutive. Thus, harming others effectively harms the self, and the best way to benefit oneself may be to benefit others. This entanglement idea was the ancient idea of all cultures that have lasted, including my own civilization. The beautiful idea of Indra's net is about the world being constituted of these nodes with interlinkages, and the whole is reflected in each node, and each node reflects in the whole in dynamic, fluid change all the time, with each affecting all. This is nature's economy. Because we've spent about 500 years thinking of nature as dead, as terra madre, as an object to be manipulated, to be conquered. Bacon's work on subjugating nature, Descartes' work on the world as a machine, were all very long-term efforts to basically take life out of the earth and self-organization out of the earth, and therefore create a dislocation and a diseconomy where the extraction from the earth got counted as economy. But as I said, this is chromatistics, this is not economy. The living earth has evolved, the biodiversity of our living planet, from the viruses and the biomes to ecosystems and species over 4 billion years of brilliant evolution. Gaia weaves the web of life, the threads and relationships that connect that biodiversity, and we are one little tiny strand in it. We are not the masters, we are not the conquerors. And people are going through so much trauma because of the climate havoc right now. But that trauma comes from the fact that having lived in a mind space of mastery and having forgotten the living earth, we are giving up the spaces where we can be part of the regeneration system. I work in agriculture now for 4 decades because of all the crises related to agriculture. And I realized that the same things, processes that allow us to have life, are processes that allow the planet to cool itself, that allow us to solve the problem of hunger and regenerate the soil, regenerate biodiversity, regenerate the climate system. Through her biodiversity and biosphere, the living earth self-regulated her climate. And this is what the NASA scientist, James Lovelock, recognized, that Gaia is a self-organized living organism because she regulates the climate. She took the temperatures of the carbon-rich atmosphere down from 290 degrees for a hot planet without life to 13 degrees. And through the processes of life, the Earth reduced the 98% carbon dioxide-rich atmosphere, which had 4,000 parts per million, to 0.03 parts per million, and increased the oxygen by the same processes. There's so much talk these days. Oh my God, how are we going to capture the carbon? How many, we create $1 billion coal-fired power plant and another $1 billion carbon storage and sequestering system. Now, these systems are energy intensive and they have entropy. No one has looked at that bit because it's all become a linear calculus of linear carbon flows. The technology of photosynthesis that allows plants and microbes to capture the sunlight and the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and transform it into oxygen, our breath, is also a carbon sequestration system. And the research has shown, I won't go into too much detail, that we have the potential by increasing the biodiversity on the planet, by growing more intensive, biodiversity intensive agriculture, more biodiverse intense forest, grasslands, that we can draw down more than 130, 140 gigatons per year, while producing more food, while creating livelihoods. The blindness to nature's economy is a blindness to people's economy. So there's nature's economy, which is the heart of all economies, and it sustains sustenance economies of the kind that have lasted thousands of years of Australia, 10,000 years of India, 10,000 years of China, of the Amazon forest. A recent 200,000 years ago, we arrived as a species. Some of our cultures have been around for half that period, cultivating the earth. And I say this particularly because there's huge misconceptions. I myself have done so much work on how an industrial agriculture system based on extractivist logic of commodification has given us 75% of the ecological problems we face. But this conversion comes from that same mindset that forgot that the earth is creative, productive, and we can be co-creators and co-producers with the earth. Because Mother Earth is living, she has rights. I was part of a process of the rights of Mother Earth. The UN General Assembly adopted the rights of Mother Earth, and that's why the Earth Day, 22nd of April, is now called Mother Earth Day. And in this declaration of the rights of Mother Earth, we say, Mother Earth is an indivisible community of diverse and independent beings with whom we share a common identity and to whom we must relate in ways that benefit Mother Earth. And because we are part of this pulsating earth, we are one earth family. Other beings are our relatives. Other species are not obstructions for our life. They are the generators of the conditions of life. They are the co-creators of the infrastructure of life. Diversity is nature's organizing principle. This is what I've learned both from my decades on the forest issue, my work in agriculture, all of these decades, but also my work in the new thinking about living systems. Nature's organizing principle is based on emergence, evolution, and resilience. Diversity in forms of expressions, flows, and relations is how nature creates value and strength. Value means valere, to be strong. That means to be resilient. Nature does not create monocultures and uniformity. Nature does not create fences and walls of division and separation, of ownership and private property. Nature's gifts are the first for the sustenance of all beings on earth, not just for the humans. All beings have a right to the gifts of the earth. Nature's economy is therefore a commons of life, and living is commoning. Again, colonialism gave rise to the idea of private property. If you look at the literature of colonial times, Cook visits Australia and finds they haven't destroyed the land, and therefore he says, therefore they can't be fully human, because the assumption of the colonizers was you must destroy, you must leave a footprint. And Locke, talking about the people of the First Nations of your land, is talking about how primitive they are because they don't disturb the land. You know, they don't hold the bison captive, and they don't fence their farms. But each of these measures is a measures of a colonial process, not of co-evolution and co-living. Nature's economy is not an extractive economy. An extractive economy is a result of the market shaping the economy, therefore needing those parts of the economy that are commodities and can be sold and bought. I'll give you two examples. So when the women of my region rose to protect the forest, I remember a particular day of action where they took out lanterns, and the foresters said to them, can't you see the sun is out? You don't need lanterns during daylight. And they said, it's not for the sun, it's for you. Because you think these forests are timber mines. But these forests are the sources of our life. They're the sources of our soil and water and air. These are the ecological services that scientists are today talking about. My sisters who'd never been to school were saying this 1972, 73, yeah, because of their lived experience. And a very big part of colonialism has been the creation of actually an epistemic apartheid, that the knowledge of those who live in and with nature, it doesn't count. It's the Baconian knowledge of conquest, of extraction, that the only expert knowledge. And it is now reaching its absurd limits, and I will, towards the end, talk to you about it. So I've done many books on the fact that when eucalyptus plantations are introduced, in the name of increasing productivity, they've only increased the flow of pulpwood, but they've destroyed food, farming, water systems, the biodiversity of needs from trees, like the Pongamia. We did a whole report on the ecological audit of eucalyptus cultivation. And the extractive economy makes you blind, and it is what shapes what I have called the monoculture of the mind, a mind that does not see nature's economy, a mind that does not see their people living in a sustenance economy with nature, a mind that does not see anything but the profits of the extractor. I was compelled to look at agriculture in 1984. It was the year when violence broke out in the state where I had done my MSc honors in particle physics. It was a peaceful state in the 70s when I graduated. By 84, it had erupted in violence. 30,000 people were dead. And the Green Revolution was given a Nobel Peace Prize. You know, Ms. Norman Borlaug got a Nobel Peace Prize. And I'm saying to myself, if he got a peace prize, why is there war in Punjab, the first place where the Green Revolution was introduced? That same year in the city of Bhopal, a pesticide plant leaked and killed thousands of people. Yeah. Until today, children are being born deformed. People have lost their lungs and their eyesight. They've lost their livelihoods. So at the end of the year, I was working then for the United Nations University on a program on conflicts over resources. And I said, we must look at this because there's something going on that is not explainable. Why is there so much violence? So I studied the Green Revolution, and I found that the Green Revolution really was a system for substituting nature's economy and all her processes of renewing soil fertility with regeneration, with the soil organisms, of regenerating biodiversity, of managing pests and weeds through biodiverse intensive systems. Because in a balanced ecosystem, there are no pests, there are no weeds. The appearance of pests and weeds is actually a sign that the system is now unstable. What was done was basically, after the wars, the chemicals that had been used in the war during Hitler's time, chemicals to kill people in concentration camps, poison gases to kill people in the war, fixing of atmospheric nitrogen to make explosives, but it also became the basis of the nitrogen fertilizers, which is why so many bombs are fertilizer bombs. All of this were instruments of conquest. And therefore, it's not an accident that three things happened. First, the biodiversity that has fed humanity disappeared. We used to eat 10,000 species of plants in huge variation. In India, the rice alone had 200,000 varieties bred by the farmers. The monocultures of the Green Revolution reduced this to rice and wheat and corn in the first generation of industrial agriculture. In the second generation of genetic engineering for globally traded commodities, corn, canola, soya, cotton, because these could be manipulated for the two traits of genetic engineering, the trait of putting pesticides into the plant, the Bt toxin trait, and the trait for making plants resistant to Roundup. And huge, as you will be seeing, there's huge debates taking place still around Roundup. One of the courts of the US has just hauled up the Environment Protection Agency, which had recognized that glyphosate, Roundup, is the carcinogen, and then in a very manipulated meeting had removed it from that category. And the courts are now saying, go back and look at your evidence because you have misled the country. And hundreds of thousands of people have died in the US, which is the biggest user of Roundup. So we've created pests and weeds. Then we've created genetic engineering, which has created super pests and super weeds. Biodiversity has been displaced by monocultures of a few commodities. The qualities of those few crops has also declined. Our research has shown that actually what people are eating, particularly in North America, is nutritionally empty crops. They're not eating food because the soil organisms provide the nourishment to the plants which we eat. Organic foods have 70 to 80% more nutrition than the chemically grown foods. And that's why now they are rushing with biofortification. If we robbed the crops of zinc, let's put zinc as an external element, or new genetic engineering for iron, new genetic engineering for vitamin A. All of this is unnecessary. in Nadania, we shifted the indicator. We said the yield merely measures what leaves as a commodity. It is not the status of the farm or the ecosystem. The ecosystem health depends on the health of the soil. The ecosystem health depends on the health and richness of biodiversity and its relationship. Ecosystem health depends on how much replenishing of water are you doing. The other day on our farm, partly because of the heat wave, I decided to work with our team. And I said, let us compare the temperature of soil on our farm, which has biodiversity, including biodiversity of trees on the field boundaries, and the neighboring farmers who are using urea. The temperature difference was 25 degrees. That's the difference between whether a crop will go or not. You know, the outside temperature is the same, but you can literally cool the soil by enriching the land with plants, which then with the soil microorganisms, like the mycorrhizal fungi, do all kinds of work to not just bring the temperature down, to bring the moisture up. The difference in moisture was 15%. We have taken all of this for granted, and we've turned everything that an ecosystem can produce as an external input that must be provided. So people don't even imagine you can have agriculture with conservation of soil moisture. 1% organic matter can hold as much as 160,000 liters of water in a hectare. It can be a water reservoir. Rich soil can be a water reservoir, but rich soil is also the secret to food productivity. Now, new research is showing that soils rich in organic matter, which are rich in mycorrhizal fungi, can increase photosynthesis 5-fold. That means they can increase photo productivity 5-fold just by nourishing the soil. So you replaced biodiversity with monocultures. You created external inputs, which then further depleted the capacity of the ecosystem to support life. Let me run through the figures of my various books and studies. I wrote a book called Soil Not Oil in the lead up to the Copenhagen Climate Summit, because agriculture was being left out. The interesting thing is agriculture is now being paid attention to, but with the wrong paradigm, and I'll talk about it later. Suddenly agriculture is at the center of all climate solutions, but the wrong kind of agriculture, the wrong kind of food system. At that point, I had assessed, if you take the production system, which is about 14%, both the fossil fuel use in huge mechanization, as well as the fossil fuel use in chemicals like nitrous oxide, 1 kilogram of urea uses 2 liters of diesel, which then it doesn't just emit CO2, it emits nitrous oxide 300 times more damaging than carbon dioxide. But then once you've reduced something to a commodity, rather than the flow to maintain an ecosystem, commodities do not have a limit because they're defined by the money that can be made, not by the need there is. So GM soya was started, but then GM soya is going 80 to 90% for biofuel and animal feed. And then there's not enough land in the US for this, so you've got to invade forests of the Amazon. Palm oil, similar, you've got to invade the forests of Indonesia. By 2030, the United Nations is saying the forests of Indonesia will go for palm oil monocultures. So the destruction of forests is another 20% of emissions. But then is the huge chain of turning food into processed food, ultra-processed food, packaged food. I've done some archaeology of waste sites. 75% of the waste, of the solid waste, is all food packaging and wasted food, 75%. That is another 20%. And then, of course, because you privileged uniformity, from the farm onwards, you have destruction of food, that's about 4%. We're talking about a 50% accounting of an industrial food system for the climate havoc, but the same system is responsible for species destruction. In 1995, there was an FAO Plant Genetic Resources Conference in Leipzig. And at that point, the governments were reporting that 75% of the cultivated biodiversity has gone because of what they call modern varieties, the green revolution, industrial agriculture. That was 95. Since then, we've had an expansion of monocultures and industrialization. I would assess about 90% of cultivated diversity is gone. But what you do on the farm doesn't just decide what happens on the farm. The insects start to disappear, 80% disappearance of insect species, insecticodon. On our farm, where we conserve biodiversity, we have 6 times more pollinators than the forest next door, which counters the falsehood that agriculture must be ecologically destructive. Industrial agriculture works on principles of warfare. Ecological agriculture works according to the principles of ecosystems. That's why agroecology and regenerative agriculture is a growing trend all over the world, no matter how much push for further industrialization is taking place. The displacement of diversity by monocultures is always made to look like an increase because what's measured is the commodity that's moving through trade. But the decrease in the ecosystem, the decrease in the local economy, the decrease in the sustenance economy is not counted. Now that's the work that ecological economics has done. I personally, I've done the study on mining in my valley for our Ministry of Environment, and they wanted us to look at the impact of mining. And what we did is working, because I believe in participatory research, I believe the people who are impacted directly know the best about what's happening to the ecosystem. So I talked to the women in the villages. I said, what's going on? And they said the water. Water was not even a discussion in the Ministry of Environment. They were talking about how ugly the mountains look with the mining because our Prime Minister had made a comment. So we did the geohydrology studies. We mapped the springs. We did the economics of how much economy is sustained by the water flow. And our study showed that the limestone left in the mountains had a bigger economy when all activities were taken into account than the extractive economy of taking the limestone to make cement or put it into a steel plant. And that study of ours led to the closure of the mines because the Supreme Court of India ruled that destroying the life support is destroying the right to life, and Article 21 of India's constitution says the state has a duty to protect people's lives, and therefore secure ecosystems and life support systems are part of the right to life. I know I've personally, and I know many ecological economists have personally used the valuation of destruction and comparison of healthy ecosystems to the destruction to basically put a red light on destructive activities. We have never had the arrogance of knowing the complexity of ecological system. We have never had the arrogance of putting a value, a commercial value on these systems. As David Ehrenfeld wrote, that he talked about how the idea of, I'm just looking for his quotation, give me a moment. Basically, he's saying that the minute you start, here it is, the first thing that matters in any important decision is the tangible magnitude of the dollar costs and benefits. If conservation is to succeed, the public must come to understand the inherent wrongness of the destruction of the biological diversity. Now, the fact that indigenous communities have been able to conserve biodiversity is because they've practiced multiple values, spiritual values, so they have sacred sites. It's not an accident that 80% of the biodiversity of the planet today is on the little bit of 25% of the land where the indigenous people are. Shouldn't we be looking at lessons on ecological economics on those systems? Shouldn't we be looking at how to practice ecological economics in partnership with the earth without harming biodiversity, in fact, regenerating it? Our work in Navdanya has shown that regeneration is a very powerful process, because all you're doing is serving the existing processes of a living earth. You are not mastering the earth. You're not engineering the soil organisms. You're just giving back a little bit of organic matter. We have 3,000% more fungi than the chemical farms next door. We have 100% more nitrogen and carbon. We have more zinc and magnesium, all these vital elements. That regeneration is the regeneration of the earth, as long as we are not playing a destructive role. We know now that we are in an ecological emergency. No one can deny the climate havoc. No one can deny the species extinction. No one can deny that we have a desertification crisis and a huge water crisis. But just in the last year, in 2021, I would say that the financial world is trying to hijack nature's economy by not allowing nature's measures to be the measure, but the measures of the financial world to be the measure. In 2008, you might remember, we had the collapse of the Wall Street. And you remember how the same subprime loan was sold many times over, derivative securitization, it was the same home. But the multiplication in the financial system happened many times over. Same 2008, the financial world started to speculate on food. But when the same fictitious wheat is traded 100 times, it inflates the price of wheat. That is the true reason there is an inflation of prices of wheat, not the Ukraine war. Ukraine war has caused slight damage. But the real inflation is because speculators are controlling 75% of the trade in this few months, since March this year, if you look at the data. So we know how the financial world can create fictitious assets and multiply them many times over. This is what was done when the Wall Street collapse took place. This is what is being done now. There is a new attempt to create natural asset companies. This was done exactly 1 month before the Glasgow summit. And I do hope the community of ecological economists will start looking at this closely. The idea of the natural asset companies is basically they will own ecosystems. They will own the water in ecosystems. They will own all the services. If the 2008 crisis had multiplied a 90 trillion economy of real goods and services to the fictitious economy of 502 trillion in the financial world, the current attempt is to create a fictitious economy of 4,000 trillion by turning nature into an asset. And this is particularly rapid in the area of biodiversity. Britain used to be part of the European Union, and then they had a Brexit. And every day I look at how the Brexit was not just leaving the European Union, the Brexit was leaving the earth. It is an exit from the earth and violating every rule of nature's economy. Last year, a famous economist put out the Dasgupta report to say biodiversity has to be an asset. I have never seen a profiteer protect a species. More significantly, just yesterday, I received a series of a new calculus, a whole new calculus called new words, I think we need to make a dictionary of nonsensical terms that are being created by chromatistics. The biodiversity net gain system that Brexit has created. And Brexit is basically reducing biodiversity to habitat, and then the habitat itself is being given fictitious equivalents elsewhere. Governments do not create nature. Governments do not sustain ecological systems. But governments are allocating themselves the power to assign credits to the polluters. We have reached a very strange situation. In 1992 at the Earth Summit, we managed to put in place two very important ecological principles that have guided all policy making. The first was the polluter must pay. In India, we have won many cases in making the polluter pay. And the second was the precautionary principle. If you don't know enough, make an error on the side of caution. Do not rush through. This has been used again and again on new technologies. The precautionary principle, of course, is being given a go by with the new GMOs, the gene-edited GMOs. But more importantly, the polluter pays principle has been turned on its head. New gymnastics in the financial world are taking place to reward the polluter with new exclusive rights to the Earth systems. If the biodiversity net gain logic is allowing the destroyers, they call it the national, especially NSIPs, are the important developments. What are the important developments? Road building, expansion of urban areas, which must destroy biodiversity. And yet in the fictitious calculus of the financial world, they actually have a net gain because the real world of biodiversity is left and financial tricks allow the finances to increase, and then there's a net gain. Please do look at these new systems or take the net zero in the climate solution. I have on my table Bill Gates' book, How to Avoid a Climate Disaster. He has a section there on net zero. He wrote it before net zero entered the climate discussions. And he says net zero doesn't mean getting rid of pollution. It means finding offsets elsewhere. The biodiversity net gain is the same language, finding offsets elsewhere. So what's going to happen? You've got this turning nature into a financial asset, a $4,000 trillion economy. You've got the climate net zero. You've got the biodiversity net gain, all based on offsets. What will these offsets be? These offsets will be the land of indigenous people, which are rich in biodiversity, which will be allocated as rights through the financial investment systems. We have seen in our world how the financial power of the World Bank and IMF has driven so much ecological destruction. I used to smile to myself, I said, I didn't even know there was something called a World Bank. In physics, you don't study all this. And I always say with a joke, I found the World Bank hiding behind a eucalyptus tree. I said, why are the farmers planting eucalyptus? It's not an indigenous tree. It's destroying the water system. Why are they planting? And then I found the World Bank was behind it. You find the extra dams built on rivers. The World Bank is behind it. Green Revolution, the World Bank is behind it. The power of finance, whether it be the old financial institutions of the Bretton Woods institutions, or the new financial power of the BlackRocks and the Vanguards, which are the asset management funds of the billionaires. I've written a book on this called Oneness versus 1%. Do look at it, because I wrote it when I watched how the governments were actually playing on the instruction of the billionaires. Now, the billionaires were setting the agenda. And in my worldview, the earth sets the agenda. Communities, local communities with rights derived from the earth set the agenda in a democracy. And I talk about earth democracy as the power of the earth. And earth democracy, in my view, is based on living economies, which are nature's economies, living democracy, where people practice care for the earth and exercise their rights. And just like ecology and economics don't have to be in conflict, if the economy works in nature's laws, in a similar way, people's rights and nature's rights don't have to be in conflict when people's rights flow from the rights of nature. And then living cultures, because we are living, particularly you in America, are living through such divisions at the social level. It is like cracks have come through in society. And these are getting amplified by the social media. They're getting amplified by all kinds of interest groups. But most importantly, A disunited humanity is becoming a common aggressor against the earth. Whereas a united humanity can be a common regenerator of the earth, defending their rights. If you look at oneness versus 1%, or in Italy, my new book has just come out, From Greed to Care. We have the power, we have the capacity to regenerate Earth's systems so that no being is derived their right to live. No person is derived their right to food, to water, to clean air, to energy. All this is ecologically possible. But that will only happen if we follow two rules. The first rule is the rule that the earth is for all. The earth is a commons. The earth cannot be reduced either to enclosures of the commons. First it was land, then they attempted seed, and my life has been dedicated to keeping seed in the commons. I did not accept at a meeting in 1987, where the chemical industry was saying, we are not making enough money, therefore we must use genetic engineering to have patents, and we will use the World Trade Organization to impose these patents on the world, so no farmer can save seed, and all seed in the world will be our seed by the year 2000. I feel so grateful that I was able to start saving seeds. And I can tell you, except for 4 or 5 crops in a few countries, most crops are GMO free. And the idea that seed saving is a duty has spread around the world. Seed banks are being created everywhere. Seed libraries are being created everywhere. And food cultivated from these heritage foods, which is so much more nutrition, because it's not the weight of a tomato that matters, not the size of the tomato that matters, but the nourishment in it, which comes from the breeding, which was for nourishment, and from the soil. Those are the new interconnections we need to make. If you look into the future, we are living through a time where not only are large parts of nature being destroyed, but the remaining is being appropriated as assets. But look at the absurd images I see of New York homes being beyond the reach of New Yorkers, Toronto homes being beyond the reach of the Torontons, farmers not being able to access their own land. 75% of the farmland of America is rented back by the farmers from the financial institutions. I have a book called Who Really Feeds the World that gives this data. So we are being pushed into a rental economy where just to live, to produce food, to have a home, we have to constantly pay rents that are escalating because the same financial giants are taking control of the food, they're taking control of a home, they're taking control of land. Let me just mention that I'm sure you would not imagine that Mr. Microsoft is the biggest farmland owner of the United States right now, and is deciding the agriculture of the world through his Gates Ag 1. This year, when the climate summit will take place, there is already a growing movement of people bringing in all the costs of industrial agriculture and all the benefits of regenerative agroecology, and showing that this idea of agricultural innovation, which is more rapid industrialization of food, is already prepared and said, we will now no more be growing crops for people to eat. We will be growing crops as raw material for lab food. And there's already this determination, food will come from the labs. Farms will produce raw material. There'll be farming without farmers, fish without fisheries, fisher folk. And this is basically an extinction crisis, an extinction sentence to the producers of the world who nourish us today and who work with the earth. I have never accepted extinction as inevitable. I have worked in service with the earth to regenerate the biodiversity. I think collectively, as a community of concerned ecologists who work at economic values, it is important to start saying that 99% of humanity cannot be made redundant. That humanity is part of nature. As I said earlier, we are a strand in the web of life. Our work is to maintain that web of life. Our work is not to go to extinction along with the other species, 200 a day, a million threatened. We cannot become a threatened species. Our work is to regenerate our future, regenerate our living economies, regenerate the commons, regenerate the beautiful idea that Gandhi laid out. The earth has enough for everyone's needs, but not for a few people's greed. We need to transcend beyond greed and the scarcity it creates into the sharing and the abundance that it creates. And none of these words I use without experience and without science and without experimentation. We live in such a generous world. We live in a rich earth, an abundant earth. We cannot witness the tragedy of the shrinking of our capacity to support life. We have to be part of the regeneration. And that to me is ecological economics. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Shiva, for this wonderful talk. As ecological economics, we can really relate to your work, and we are grateful to have you share your journey. And I've also put down a few notes on some of the things that you've called on us to work on. And I'm sure others would agree that these are important points that needs to be looked at. So at this point, I would like to open the floor for members to ask questions.
Hello, you mentioned 2 rules that we need to live by in the future. And the first was share the earth as a commons. What was the second rule?
The second rule is biodiversity, diversity. Nature does not create monocultures. And therefore we have to mimic nature. We must mimic the diversity she gives us.
Okay.
Okay, thanks for that question. Feel free to go ahead, unmute yourself and ask a question.
Good morning, Dr. Shiva. This is Mahadev Bhatt from Florida International University Agroecology Program. I have the fond memory of meeting you in Miami almost 10 years ago. I am so glad that you mentioned about agroecology. That's a program that we have developed here in Miami at our university for more than 15 years now. One question I have is that, there are people who would argue that this regenerative agriculture or agroecological, methods would be, fine for small scale agriculture. But how would we scale this up to that 99% level, worldwide, in a fashion that we can really feed, humanity? Humanity that is what, 7.2, 7.5 billion people. I know this is a common question you would also get, I'm pretty sure. What would be your response to that?
Yeah. So if you look at the statistics today, 80% of the food we eat, not the food that's traded, but the food we eat, comes from small farms. This is FAO statistics. Yeah. So if small farms are more productive, and all the data shows, all my books have it, and we had a former prime minister called Charan Singh, who had said, if I have 100 acres, I'd rather give them to 20 small farmers than to one large landlord, because the 20 small farmers will give to the land what the large landlord cannot. He will give it love and care. And that is the factor of increasing productivity. So one is the issue of small is not unproductive. The second is scaling up always means a vertical concentration of land ownership, whereas scaling outwards means hundreds and thousands of farms. So scaling up is a concentration of ownership of land, which normally means that the giant-sized 100,000 square mile landlord, which is now a bank and not a farmer, will try their best to minimize all costs and will therefore use more and more violence. Will use more digital agriculture, will use more spraying from drones, will use heavy machinery and now tractorless, driverless tractors. So if you look at the ecological footprint of that system, it is huge. And if you look at the nutritional footprint of that system, it is very thin, as I mentioned earlier. In US, industrial food has lost 70, 80, 90% of its nutrition. And organic farming, agroecology brings nourishment back into the food. Food is nourishment. Food is not a commodity. Food is not fuel. You know, when I did my work on the Green Revolution, I couldn't believe the literature. The soil was an empty container for pouring nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium into. Soil was not living. Yeah? Food was fuel to run the machinery of our body. Our body is a sophisticated organism with 100 trillion microbes in our gut, managing food richness and biodiversity. So I think this broken reductionist paradigm that is very important for control is obsolete. We need the living systems paradigm, whether it's looking at the planet as a whole to understand climate change, or looking at species, or looking at farms. So when you scale out, our work, I mean, we have a report called Health Per Acre, and I think it's available for free download on our website, because I said, I'm not going to measure yield per acre. It tells me nothing about the land, the farmer, about the food, you know? So we're going to measure nutrition per acre. And by biodiverse intensification, we actually increase nutrition per acre, because the more the biodiversity, the more the nutrition. We believe biodiversity conservation is the foundation of production. The two are not in competition. Conservation and production are not oppositional. They are in a paradigm of conflict, but in a paradigm of cooperation, they're not. Our study shows, we took our data from 200 farms and then extrapolated it to India's agricultural land. We could feed 2 times India, 2 times the population of India, with rich nourishment, compared to the fact that today, half of Indian children are malnourished, and every 4th Indian is hungry, because we are not growing food for nourishment. We are growing commodities. Even the Green Revolution was a commodity producing system: rice and wheat, rice and wheat, rice and wheat. Food needs diversity. So, you know, we have to bring the continuum between the soil, the farm and its agroecology, and our gut microbiome. That linkages will tell you what is the true food story. Everything else will give you a commodity story. And of course, you can have more and more commodities, but 1 billion people are hungry in the world. And when those commodities are speculated on, you're going to have another 500 million hungry. It's not a nourishing system. It's not a food system. I call it an anti-food system, because if it works against the soil, if it works against your health, if it works against the planet, it is not maintaining the systems that give you food.
Thank you.
Dr. Shiva, your message was so powerful, and it's really amazing to reflect on the decades of work that you've done in this space and bringing these concepts to the global consciousness. And I'm just thinking about the young people that I teach, you know, the 18 to 21-year-olds. I think that they are, more than older generations, very conscious of what you're talking about, that the current systems we have are kind of running us off of a cliff, and we need to reconsider the relationship we have with the earth. And, you know, you see the global activism of young people contributing to that. But I also find that they're very, very prone to kind of discouragement and despair over, you know, the magnitude of the problems that we face as a global community. So I guess, what advice would you have from your decades of experience in activism for those young people that are trying to make changes and trying to lead us in a new direction, to keep them hopeful and keep them strong in what they're working towards?
Yeah, I never take a position of giving advice to anyone. I think it's so arrogant, you know, who am I to? But I will invite young people to join the process of hope. Yeah. So we have created it. When I watch the women, the widows of the farmers who committed suicide, 400,000 farmers of India have committed suicide since globalization, since the Monsantos entered. 85% of these suicides are in the cotton areas. 95% of the cotton is Monsanto. Yeah. So when I go to these villages and the women were in total despair, and I said, you at least have this little patch around your hut. You've lost your husband, you've lost your land, but at least you have this hut and you have your children to feed. let's grow gardens of hope, and I bring them seeds. So this movement of gardens of hope has spread. We also have an Earth University, and I would really like to have a partnership with the Society for Ecological Economics and the Earth University, where young people come. Young people come to learn, because we are facing three crises. The first is the planetary crisis of climate and biodiversity jointly, because the two are non-separable. The second is the crisis of inequality and poverty. And the third is the crisis of the future. But to me, all three crises are one crisis, because a tiny group of people is taking others' share, and including the share of the earth to recycle her systems. Yeah, the circular economies of the earth, they're being disrupted. The economic inequality, the inequality virus, as Oxfam has called it, comes from the same roots, the appropriation and inclusions. And the hopelessness of the youth comes also from this. So the first is to reclaim our own power at a time where we are being told we are insignificant and powerless. And that's why, for me, the understanding of energy, the understanding of entropy, the understanding of our creative potential and the creative potential of the earth is very, very vital, because through that, young people find their avenues. The unemployment crisis, the climate crisis, and the food crisis are addressed by the same methods. Of course, we'll have to be very, very innovative. I don't think we are in the moment of the French Revolution, but we have to be creative to see how different partnerships can be created. I launched for the Greater Paris region before the climate summit in 2015, a new arrangement between the citizens of Paris who have the money, all the farmers who have the land, young people who want to farm. And the word invest used to mean to make beautiful, to take care. It didn't mean money. It began to mean money only after the East India Company was created. Invest is not money. We need to combine different investments in new partnerships and new cooperations. And this definitely will mean creating new forms of economic arrangements beyond the individual private property and beyond the selling of your labor in a market that doesn't want your labor. You see, what had been done when your land's taken away, you can sell your labor power. But if the system is saying we don't need people, we have robotics and artificial intelligence, we don't need people. Zuckerberg said this. He said 99% people will be useless. That's why he's creating his metaverse. But we shouldn't let the real world become a metaverse. And in the real world, community is where we will find our power. A lot of time has been spent in making us think the earth is dead and we are atoms and individuals. Margaret Thatcher said, there is no society, there's only individuals. And then we were told the only role of individuals is to consume. No, we are community. We are social beings. We are ecological beings. 2, creativity is our power. Consumption is a disease that has been imposed on us. We have to become producers again. And being co-producers and co-creators with the earth is where the future lies. This is where the imagination of the young people and the courage and the cooperation can find a whole new avenue. And we have to stop thinking in terms of old style, broken paradigms, and start thinking in terms of the emerging paradigm of interconnectedness, cooperation, mutuality, synergy, community, including the earth community.
Thanks for the questions and thanks for the response from Dr. Shiva. We still have time for more.
If there are no more questions, I would like to ask Dr. Shiva one quick question. She mentioned about the seeds, distribution of seeds. I mean, she was referring to these organizations that she built, Navdanya.
Navdanya, yes.
Yeah, I would like to hear a little bit, how it is.
Sure. So, as I mentioned, the 1987 meeting where the big companies, I call them the poison cartel, because they make poisons, and now it's again 4, they were 5, Bayer Monsanto, Syngenta ChemChina, Dow DuPont, which is now Corteva, and BASF. BASF is a nothing. It's used to pass through anti-competition, antitrust law. Every time they want to say we don't have a monopoly, they give it to by BASF. So I started to save seeds, and I said we're going to create community seed banks, because the idea that seed is intellectual property, that it's a creation of Monsanto, that is invented by Monsanto, that's so ontologically false. I knew nothing about seed, Dr. Bhatt. I taught I picked up my parents' old books. I'd go to the villages and ask, do you have this seed? Do you have this seed? We've created over these years 150 community seed banks. I just wanted to keep the seed free and the farmers free to save and share seed, because those were being defined as a crime. I worked with our government and our parliament, and we managed in our patent law to put a clause, Article 3J. And I have a book called Reclaiming the Commons, which is 30 years of my work on seed and biodiversity and intellectual property. It's been published by Synergetic Press in the United States, which has this whole history. But this 3J says plants, animals, and seeds are not human inventions. Therefore, they're not patentable. So we managed to keep Monsanto at bay on the patent issue, even though they did try and collect royalties. When we were saving seeds because we must save seeds. It's our duty. But in the seeds we had were climate tolerant seeds. So when the super cyclone hit in 1999 in Orissa, we could give seeds to the farmers. In 2014, the tsunami hit. Our Orissa farmers could take 2 truckloads of salt-tolerant seeds to Tamil Nadu to rejuvenate. We have saved the seeds of crops that were called primitive. I smile to myself at the construction of the idea of primitive seeds, primitive crops, primitive people. Anyone with a slight color in the skin is a primitive person. The crops is the same, the darker crops. They call them coarse grains, but they're very fine grains, the millets. And next year is the year of millet. So we said these are forgotten foods which we must make future foods. And we started to promote their cultivation, their use. Women used to eat chapatis. We started to work with people to say, oh, you can make a dosa. You can make a pizza with ragi. You can do anything with these amazing grains. So the seed banks that we created have not just created a buffer for climate resilience. Every year these days we get 2 to 3 cyclones. In the Bay of Bengal, it is one of the most impacted in terms of cyclones. But because we've saved these seeds, our communities are able to bounce back. And because they're in the commons, they can share and multiply and expand. And on the nutritional side, the nutritionally rich crops that were treated as nothing, because they were not part of a global commodity trading system, are the source for basically addressing the malnutrition crisis. And the UN has admitted this, and as 2023 is going to be the year of millets. The beauty of the seed is, first, it multiplies. We just did a calculation, from 1 carrot, 5,000 seeds we got. From 1 tomato seed, we got 1,500 seeds. Abundance is the nature of seed. Scarcity is the nature of private seed, of industrial seed. All GMOs, all patented seed give no seed at all. So it's going from 1 to 0, where we go from 1 to 1,000, 100,000 in the case of millets. The second is seed spreads if you allow it to spread. Therefore, it's a common. And the third is farmers have been the original breeders. They bred for climate resilience, for nutrition, for taste. So bringing back these native seeds is actually solving multiple problems: the health pandemic, the climate emergency, as well as the soil, because our native seeds are very tall. So we grow a lot of biomass. Large part of it can go back to the soil. We are stealing the soil's food when we make dwarf varieties, for which Norman Borlaug got his Nobel Peace Prize. So it's an exciting moment for researchers. It can become an exciting moment for future generations. The future is in our hands. It is not in the hands of those who have decided we are disposable people. We will shape our future. And that is the mindset with which we must regenerate the earth, save the seeds of the future, seeds of hope, seeds of freedom, seeds of love.
Thank you.
Do you ever get hate mail?
Oh, lots. Not to, no, and my systems keep crashing. I always smile and say, the top doctors have lost their, so many of the scientists who showed the work on GMOs, their labs were taken away from them. But, I left a job in 1982 and I came here and my mother gave me her cowshed. So the research foundation I started was in my mother's cowshed. And so there's nothing they can take away from me because they can't take away my mother's cowshed. But they try very, very hard, and they pay fake journalists to write pieces. And of course, hate mail is normal. But, for me, the love of the earth and love from the earth and love of people is so much bigger than this pathetic attempts of destructive power. I think the creative power of the universe is what will win.
So I have a question, Dr. Shiva. I noticed,
Yes,
yeah, you've really done extensive work, and I particularly enjoy listening to you saying that you also prioritize people in your research. And I think that's something that as ecological economics, we try to not only look at, we as, scholars, but we also try to involve the community. And I know a lot of ecological economists that are into participatory research. But beyond people, I know you've also dealt with governments and civil societies. And for me, my problem or the challenge is always trying to figure out an innovative way to bring together not just politicians, but people, to come to a table and make a decision that would all say, hey, I think this is the best path forward. And so let's chart it. Of course, the politicians have their own agenda. At times you find that the people also have their own agenda. And so in your own work, do you have any advice or recommendations as to how we can really bring these two groups together? Because really at the end of the day, the politicians make a lot of the decisions, and at times the people too, voting some of these corrupt politicians. And so it's like we are in a vicious cycle and it's hard to figure out how to come out of it.
Yeah. I think that, first of all, no advice again, Ronald. I never give advice as principal. I share experience and I invite people to participate. I think that at this point where we are going through this extremely unequal distribution of economic power, which is shaping political power, 10 billionaires control half the wealth of the world, 10 men. And they run the world through their BlackRocks, who now, as my book Oneness versus 1% shows, they own all the corporations of the world, who are big enough without them. But 75% of the shares and investment is the big money, which now controls government. And this process started with, the reason I spent so much time dealing with the WTO was I could see it is about erosion of democracy. And that process now has come to a very, very fragile level where democracy itself is being sacrificed. Now, if there's a working democracy where there's a government that listens to its people rather than listens to the billionaires, of course, then you just sit together, people and government sit together. At this point of history, which is a very fluid moment in history, the first thing is people have to have unity and union. Breaking overcoming the divides is the central part. We've been too divided for too long, including even the environmental movement was so divided. For me, it's all about the earth, but we had specialization of this species and that species, and the climate people didn't even look at biodiversity, and the environmentalists didn't look at agriculture. The reason I went to agriculture is I said it's an orphan of the ecology movement, and this is the biggest piece for livelihoods as well as problems and solutions. So I think at this point, building the Earth community and the Earth democracy is the single most important part. And as that grows through research, through knowledge, through innovative ways of producing and creating economies, all of that influence can be best brought at the level of local government. I'm invited very often by the C40, which is the coalition of local governments. And at local government level, you can actually start to change food policy. You can start to change transport policy, energy policy. That's where, in any case, the town hall, that's what it's for. But because I'm such a believer in diversity, I believe we need, looking at the diversity of governance systems. And governance systems don't mean just government systems. Governance systems mean any form of organized power, including the organized power of people and the organized power of the earth. For me, the earth governing herself is the single biggest lesson we need to learn on earth democracy. In the forest, we learn how diverse species survive. We need to learn from there how humanity can survive with diversity and not treat each other as a problem. So the diversity of governance systems, and from the local to the regional to the national, and we have to protect the international system that gave us the environmental treaties, because the international system is now being privatized. The climate treaty, the FAO was totally hijacked, and the WHO. So these, the world needs an international system that reflects all of the communities. One country, one vote is what the UN system was about. That's why small countries could lead the climate discussion. Small countries could lead the biosafety discussion. We cannot allow the UN system and our governments to become instruments of abuse of power and appropriation of nature by a handful of billionaires. That, to me, is the democratic challenge. And it involves every level. It involves the research that communities like you do. It involves the young people, doing their actions. And it definitely involves new community initiatives to say there is another way. We don't have to use poisons in our farming. We can do agroecology. We don't have to have seeds in the hands of 4 giant companies. We can have community seed banks. We don't have to allow privatization and commodification of water with the Nestle's and the Suezes, that we can have water as the commons. Now, these have all been tried. Wherever people get together with an effort, they make a change. But that part of change does not come from being spectators, but being participants in the process of democracy and the process of transformation.
Thank you very much for your response. We still have time for more questions. So if there are no questions, I have this one question. So in your talk, you mentioned about, I think you said something along the lines of your earth democracy and what you are doing with young kids and education in that area. And you also said, I think you said something along the lines of there's an opportunity for the United States Society for Ecological Economics, or I think, ecological economics in general, to collaborate. So can you elaborate a bit on your Earth University and what opportunities there are for collaboration?
Yeah. So, as you know, and as I started saying, ecology and economics come from the same flow, from oikos. So returning home to oikos is ecological economics. It's the discipline that brings the two home. Everywhere else, they're in conflict with each other. And sadly, as I said, so much ecology is actually going out of the vocabulary. I'm going to do one new paper on the disappearance of nature and ecology in this new financialization of nature to create a fictitious 4,000 trillion in the hands of those 10 men. And that will mean people don't have water to drink. Indigenous people will lose their rights to their forests that they have protected. Farmers won't have land. That's where the farming without farmers fits in. At the Earth University, which actually grew organically because, we were saving seeds and doing agroecology. And young people started to turn up at our doorstep. And then my colleague Satish Kumar, who founded the Green College, the Schumacher College in England, he was visiting, he said, we must have a Schumacher College here. And that's how the Earth University grew, which we also in Hindi call Bij Vidyapeeth, the School of the Seed. That was its first name. Then we realized it was too heavy a word, so we call it Earth University. We have internships, we have courses. If you go to the website, I'm very clumsy, otherwise I'd put it all in a link for you. But if you go to the website of Earth University, Navdanya Earth University, you will find the courses we offer. And I would in particular, I would love to have your students visit. We could do tailor-made courses because, this beautiful biodiversity sanctuary has so much to offer in terms of what we can learn from nature. That simple example I gave, 25% degrees difference in the soil where you cultivate with love and the urea soil, 15% difference in the moisture. So as we face a climate crisis where we're going to get extreme heat, we're going to get less water, isn't it time to do true ecological economics? And we would also like a partnership with the Society for Ecological Economics to find ways where the richness of diversity, the richness of biodiverse cultures and cultural diversity can join hands with university learning, and we can have mutuality between finding ways to build a better world for all. Let me see if I can go to, no, I don't think so.
Dr. Shiva, somebody found it and put it in the chat. And so that's a wonderful.
I know you all are so brilliant. You are brilliant.
Well, I would like to join everyone else in thanking you so much for your time today and your words of wisdom, and really powerful, a lot of things to think about. So I just want to thank you again, and a virtual round of applause. And remind everyone else that this is the link for all of the activities of the conference. And so the next thing will be starting in about 5 minutes. We'll have a paper session. Dr. Shiva, again, thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
So Robbie, I believe you're recording. Maybe if you want to stop recording so we can keep this as the separate plenary